Confident, confident, confident. I can be confident, 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 confident. I can be confident at work.
Hello and welcome to the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and your confidence coach, Anna Manning. And today I'm excited because we have a very special guest interview with Mary Ann Seighart, who's the author of the best-selling book, The Authority Gap: Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men and What We Can Do About It. So I've loved this book and I have recommended this book to many, many people who I've worked with. Mary Ann spent 20 years as the assistant editor at the Times newspaper. She was also a columnist and won a large following for columns on politics, economics, feminism, parenthood, and life in general. She's presented many programs on BBC Radio 4 and recently spent a year as a visiting fellow of All Souls College in Oxford. She's chaired the Social Market Foundation think tank and is a visiting professor at King's College London. She sits on numerous boards and she was the chair and one of the judges for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2022. And now, to my absolute delight, she is also a guest on the Confident at Work podcast. During the interview, we discussed what the authority gap is and how it might be manifesting itself in your workplace. We discussed the sometimes pretty shocking evidence and research which Mary Ann highlights within the book and how the authority gap can subtly and not so subtly impact our confidence at work. We also talked about how we as individuals, as colleagues, as parents, and as organizations can help to close the authority gap. Because the impact of the authority gap means that we will not achieve gender parity until the gap is closed. So I encourage you to read, if you haven't already, The Authority Gap. It's a really fascinating, rich, and entertaining, easy access way of finding out about this phenomenon. And if you don't want to do that, you can watch Mary Ann's TED Talk on how to close the authority gap, which I've included in the show notes. None of the confidence problems that we talk about on this podcast and that I'm here to support you with exist in a vacuum. And that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted to have Mary Ann onto the podcast. To really understand the struggles that you might have with your confidence, it's vital that you understand the impact of the authority gap. So without further ado, enjoy the interview with Mary Ann Seighart. Okay, so welcome to the podcast, Mary Ann. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So today we're talking about the authority gap, and Mary Ann's going to explain to us a bit about what it is, how people might experience it at work, and what that can mean for our confidence. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you about is this quote at the very beginning of the book, where you say, "This book is a conscious raising exercise for all of us. For however progressive and intelligent we think we are, innumerable scientific studies show that we all, women as well as men, have unconscious bias against our own gender." So can you tell us a bit about what the authority gap is and how do we know that it exists?
The authority gap is a measure of how much more seriously we still take men than women. We're still much more reluctant to accord authority to women. And women are twice as likely as men to say that they have to provide evidence of their competence, and nearly twice as likely as men to say that people are often surprised at their abilities. And women of colour are twice as likely as white women to say these things. And so we assume that a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, whereas for a woman, it's all too often the other way around. We have to prove our competence in a way that men don't. So how the authority gap manifests itself is that women are much more likely to be underestimated, to be patronised, to be interrupted or talked over. They're more likely to have their expertise challenged. They're less likely to be listened to in general, so they find it much harder to influence a group discussion. And if they're in a position of authority, people are much more likely to resist it. And there's so much scientific evidence and research to prove this. So, for instance, there was one randomized double-blind trial in which researchers sent out applications for a lab manager position to American science professors. And they sent out identical CVs and covering letters and just randomly assigned a male or a female name at the top. And the so-called male candidate was deemed to be significantly more competent, more hireable, was offered a higher starting salary, and the professors were keener to mentor him. I say him, but and this was both male and female science professors. So women do it too. And another fascinating study looked at Supreme Court proceedings in the US. And you don't get much more authoritative than being a Supreme Court justice. And what they discovered was that the female justices were interrupted 3 times more than the male justices, 96% of the time by men. So this shows that the authority gap exists even at the very highest levels. It doesn't insulate you to be a senior woman from the authority gap.
I was particularly interested in those studies about the Supreme Court justices. Being an ex-lawyer, I found that both shocking and disappointing when I read those studies.
I know, it's really depressing, isn't it? If Ruth Bader Ginsburg got interrupted 3 times more than her male colleagues, and you just think how erudite and authoritative these women are.
And I wondered if, before those studies were done, people would have even noticed that was what was happening.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we do get so used to it, we get almost inured to it. So I don't think outside people would have noticed. I suspect the women themselves knew it happened, but it was just part of their lives. It's part of all of our lives. So many women I've spoken to when I've told them about the book have said, "Oh God, yes, you've written the story of my life." We recognize it instantly. And sometimes we just get too tired to complain about it at the time, or we're worried that it will evoke hostility from the people around us, or they'll say, "Oh God, isn't she difficult? Isn't she prickly? Isn't she oversensitive?" Or they'll tell us we're being paranoid. They'll gaslight us and say, "No, no, no, I wasn't interrupting you. I was just agreeing with you," or something like that. So we've got so tired of it, haven't we?
Perhaps you could share a little bit about your experience of it. So, obviously, you've done the research, you are the authority on the authority gap. But before you did that, I'm guessing you've experienced it in your own life, in your own career.
Oh, in all sorts of ways. That actually, even after writing the book, I'm still experiencing it. I gave a talk about the authority gap to a dinner of CEOs and chairs. They were all very senior, most of them men. And I gave this talk, and one man who was a CEO of a big company said, I've got operations in the UK, in the US, and the Australia, and I can tell you, you are wrong." And he was jabbing his finger at me and telling me that I was wrong. And I said, "Well, have you read the book?" And he said, "No, but from my experience, I can tell you, I've been in business all my life. This just doesn't happen. You're wrong." And I said, "Well, I think you will find there is an enormous amount of evidence in the book that this does exist. There's actually 30 pages of bibliography. But anyway, what I'd really like to do is thank you for giving me such a great case study for the next edition of the authority gap, because here you are playing it out in everyday life. You are challenging my authority from a position of relative ignorance. I'm the person who's done all the research and has the expertise, and you're just telling me I'm wrong." I mean, would this man have said that to a man who had written a book like this? I mean, you're shaking your head. I know for a fact that he wouldn't have done it. Men don't treat each other like that. But he's so used to behaving that way that he doesn't notice. And even when challenged, I'm sure he'd say to himself, "Oh, I'd say that to a man," but he wouldn't have done. I had another example when had been at a conference and I was sitting next to a man at dinner that evening, and we'd both been at the same conference and talking about interesting things, and he asked me what I did. And I led a portfolio life at the time. So I reeled through a list of all the jobs at the boards I was sitting on and that sort of thing, because I didn't know which would interest him more. And he then said, "Wow, you're a busy little girl."
Oof.
I was about 50, older than the then Prime Minister. And I was so shocked. I said, "Gosh, I don't think I've been called a little girl since I was about 6. And I remember it annoying me even then. But then I said to him, "I bet you wouldn't have called a man a busy little boy." And he said, "Oh, yes, of course I would. Of course I would. It was just a joke." But he wouldn't have done, would he?
I really tried to think, after I read that bit of the book, I tried to think, are there moments where I'm using completely different language or putting a completely different standard on the people that are in front of me. And I guess from that, I have to assume that I probably am. And
Yeah, I
that was
know I
one of,
do. I mean, I don't want to, but I do. And it's called unconscious bias for a reason. So we can't stop it happening. We can't put a lid on it, but we can notice when it manifests itself and then correct for it. And so quite often, if a woman is perhaps young and maybe has a rather high voice and sounds a bit childish, my reflex reaction will often be, oh, I wonder if she knows what she's talking about. But then instantly I notice myself thinking that and I say, no, stop it. Listen to the content of what she's saying. Don't judge her by the pitch of her voice or by her youth and just see if she does know what she's talking about. But if you don't notice it, then you're never going to correct for it.
yeah. And the great thing about the book is it gives so many scenarios and so many different stories that you can't help but put yourself in the shoes and think, hang on, I have actually been in that situation, to help you to actually notice, where am I doing this? And where is this being done to me? So I always had a situation where I would tell people that I was a lawyer and I did medical malpractice work. And I always got the same response from people, which was like, oh, and I always thought that must be because I don't look like a lawyer or I don't dress like a lawyer or something. But after reading the book, I thought, was it that? Or was it this unconscious bias that told them that I probably wasn't that before I told them that I was? And now
Exactly.
I'm starting to wonder.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. So that, their default expectation of you is that you're not going to be senior, intelligent, successful, and therefore they're surprised when you are. Whereas if you were a man of your age and background, they wouldn't automatically assume that he wasn't that sort of person. They would wait to hear what he was.
Yeah. And there was a few different things in the book, and you mentioned in the introduction there that we might be underestimated, we might be interrupted, we might be patronized, we might be subjected to more challenge than man would, and that's because of the authority gap. When you say we subjected to more challenge, can you tell us a little bit about that? What did you see in the research?
Well, I had a great conversation with a woman called Shubi Rao, who used to be treasurer of Alphabet, which was the parent company of Google. So, an enormous job. She said when a man suggests something at a meeting, the guys would say, yeah, yeah, great idea, let's do it. When a woman suggests something at a meeting, they'd say, oh, I'm not sure about that. Have you got any data to back it up? Can you prove it? Maybe we should think a bit longer about it. And she said she was subjected to this sort of challenge the whole time. This was just her life. And she just had to get used to it. Now, this is a woman in a really senior position. But it's because I think particularly men often feel uncomfortable with the notion that a woman has authority both in terms of power and expertise. And therefore, because of their egos feeling a bit threatened, they feel they've got to push back in a way that they don't to other men.
And I'm guessing because that's unconscious, that is completely hidden from their view. They won't be thinking, I'm going to challenge more because this is a female. They'll just be thinking, this needs challenging more.
Absolutely. And my whole mission in spreading the word about the authority gap is that people start to question their own habits and think to themselves, and I always say, just flip it. Would I have done that or would I have thought that if this person had been a man rather than a woman? And if not, try and notice when you're doing it and stop doing it. And it takes a bit of
Absolutely.
an effort of will, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes till eventually it's a reflex action. And you don't interrupt women more than men. You do listen to them just as attentively. You don't challenge their expertise as much, but you've got to notice and care about it.
And I think there was a time when we thought that if women reached 50-50 in terms of the numbers of women, say in a senior position, we probably thought that that was mission accomplished. Job done. Gender parity has been achieved. But actually, what we find out from the authority gap is that that's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, I mean, I don't think we ought to be campaigning to get more than 50-50 representation. But I think it's necessary but not sufficient to close the gap because we've got to change the culture as well as the number of women at the top. And even if you've got 50-50 women at the top, if the workplace culture is still one in which there's a lot of authority gap and they're just having to try so much harder than the men to be taken seriously, then we've still got a problem.
Absolutely. And have you described we are being more underestimated, more interrupted, potentially more patronized, more challenged consistently throughout your career? I can imagine what that does to somebody's confidence.
Yeah, it's really exhausting and it's really depleting. And every time this happens, I mean, each individual instance of the authority gap is not going to be career ending, but it's like a little dent to your confidence every time it happens. If you make a point at a meeting and no one takes a blind bit of notice until a man makes it 10 minutes later and everyone gives him credit for it, you're going to think, oh gosh, maybe I wasn't confident enough, or I wasn't articulate enough, or I just didn't put that point very well and he made it better. Actually, no, the trouble was you were just too female. And in fact, there's fascinating research showing that men have 6 times more influence in group discussions than women do. There's a great study showing this. And so I think once you can internalize that and realize that it wasn't personal and it wasn't your fault, it's simply the way we've all been socialized and conditioned, I think that can help you build your confidence a bit, because you're no longer beating yourself up for it.
What I've found so often in the women who come to me for training and coaching is that problems that they're experiencing in their external life, like the interruption or the patronizing or having their authority challenged, are such part of the daily life and the routine that they've assumed there's some deficit in them.
Mm.
And the reason why they are not as confident, perhaps, as one of their colleagues or a male equivalent, is just some deficit in them.
No, I mean, the thing is, we are twice as likely to suffer from imposter syndrome as men, but that's because we're treated as imposters. So it's not surprising that we feel like imposters if men are implying that we're not good enough for the job, that we're not expert enough, that we're not worth listening to. Of course, that's going to make us feel like imposters, but it's coming from the outside.
Absolutely. And if we don't notice what's actually going on, it's coming from the outside, it's ending up on the inside, and then we end up asking all kinds of questions of ourselves. And so much of the work that I do with people is around experiencing a lot of self-doubt, experiencing a lot of self-criticism, underestimating ourselves and what we can achieve, which is why I often encourage people to read The Authority Gap, because I want people to see that hasn't happened in a vacuum.
Yeah. And it's not happening most of the time to men.
And there's a reason for that. So the men who do come to me and tell me that they're having those problems, there's some other factor, either that maybe they're gay, they're Black, British, they have, they were poor and the rest of their community in their workplace didn't grow up in that. There's something else which is creating maybe for them the same kind of system or the same factor.
Exactly. So authority gaps exist obviously between men and women, but also between white people and people of color, between people who aren't disabled and people who do have disabilities, between middle class and working class people. So there are authority gaps everywhere. And basically, the further you are from the white male middle class able-bodied default, the wider the authority gap becomes.
And I'm guessing the more potential there is for that to impact your confidence and then potentially your progression, your pay.
Absolutely. I think the authority gap is the mother of all gender gaps. Because if we're not taking women as seriously as men, we're not going to hire them so readily, we're not going to promote them so fast, and we're not going to pay them as much.
And even when they ask for the promotion and they ask for the pay rise, I think there's evidence to say that they're then less liked. It is more difficult. They'll get more pushback.
Yeah. So a lot of men have said that the gender pay gap actually is just a fantasy. And if only women asked for more money, they'd get it. And it's women's fault for not being confident enough. This is just not true. All the research shows that actually these days, women do ask for pay rises as much as men do, but they're just not given them as often. And it's partly because we don't like women self-promoting. So we're very happy for men to self-promote, but women's self-promotion actually evinces feelings of disgust in people. They really dislike women who promote themselves. And that makes it very difficult for women, because if you go to a job interview, you've obviously got to, you've got to impress them. You've got to tell them what you're best at. But then you know perfectly well that this is very risky for you. Whereas for a man, it's actually very easy and no one will hold it against him. So, for instance, job interviewers could ask what they think of as a really lovely, welcoming, anodyne question, like, so tell me what you're most proud of in your life. Okay. And a woman will think, oh God, I'm not allowed to do that because they won't like me if I tell them what I'm good at. So she'll take a deep breath and say, well, I'm most proud of my two lovely children. And they'll think, oh, bless, how sweet. And they'll ask the male candidate, what are you most proud of? And he'll say, well, in my last job, I doubled revenues and I quadrupled profits. And they'll think, oh, well, he's the one we've got to hire.
So you find yourself in a kind of double bind of, if I do the thing I'm being asked to do and self-promote, I have to do it because that's what I have to do to get recognized and to get ahead in my career. But if I do it, I may be subject to more bias.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's really true. I mean, it's just true in general that if we're not confident and assertive enough, we don't get taken seriously. We're often disrespected. But if we are confident and assertive enough, we're often disliked because we are going against stereotype. And the stereotype is that women should be warm and gentle and nurturing and unselfish and unassertive and kind. And men should be confident and assertive and dominant and showing leadership. But the trouble is that if we do play to our stereotypes, we'll just be rolled over in the workplace at least. But if we start to behave like men, we're going against stereotype. That makes people uncomfortable and they dislike us. And they start calling us horrible words like abrasive or strident or aggressive or overbearing or ball breaking, scary, bitchy. These are words that are never used of men, showing exactly the same character traits. On one of my boards, we had this sort of annual, evaluation, and the chair said, well, I do find you quite scary sometimes because you're very direct. And I thought, goodness, but all my male colleagues are too. And I bet he's not scared by them. So that was telling me much more about him than it was about me.
And I guess only because you know of the existence of the authority gap that you would have thought to do that flip in your own mind and say, would he have been saying that about my director colleagues who are also very direct? Clues in the title, direct.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it does really help to flip things around every time. On another board, we were interviewing for a new audit chair. And one of the candidates was a woman who had vast experience. She'd been audit chair for about 3 other companies, really, really knew her stuff. And after the interview, one of my fellow directors said, oh, no, I really don't want her. She's too full of herself. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I mean, she clearly really knew her stuff and she was a great expert. She's done this a lot. But I wonder whether you'd have said that if she'd been a man, that he was too full of himself. So, of course, my fellow director said, yes, of course I would. Because if you challenge people like that, they tend to be quite defensive. But I really don't think he would have done. He just didn't, he thought she was being self-promoting when actually she was just explaining everything she had done, which was a lot.
And if she hadn't have done that, then she wouldn't have been up to scratch or had the experience. So she found herself in that bind in that particular interview.
There are ways through this. There are ways, what all the academic research shows. And actually, I interviewed a lot of very powerful and successful women for the book, because my thesis was if even they have experienced the authority gap, that is pretty good proof that it happens to the whole of womankind. And they said the same thing, which is that the only way through is to overlay an enormous amount of warmth onto your personality to mitigate these feelings of hostility that you might otherwise attract for being confident, competent, assertive, showing leadership. And so a lot of women said to me, oh, I use humor a lot. I try to be really emotionally intelligent. I try and read the room so as not to tread on any men's egos. I try and bond with people personally. I talk to them about their families. I try to make friends with the people who report to me, use a human touch, all these things. But it's exhausting. It's a lot of work. Some women aren't particularly good at it. And why should they be? It shouldn't have to be. a factor in deciding whether someone's going to be a good audit chair or whatever. But it's something that we have to do in order to navigate this rather narrow path between being disrespected and being disliked.
I can see why, if somebody's trying to do both things, be confident and assertive, but trying to do that right, so trying to be warm enough or soft enough, it sounds exhausting, let alone in practice.
It is. I mean, I don't find it too bad because I think naturally I probably am quite warm and human, and I like using humor. And so these sort of things come quite naturally to me. Now, I don't know whether that's because I've been conditioned to be like that because I'm female, but I don't find it too exhausting. But I would hate to have to be inauthentic and to do that if it just didn't feel it was natural to my personality. I think that would be a horrible thing. And I'm not prepared to hedge, which a lot of women do. I'm not prepared to say, well, look, of course, I'm not an expert on this, but, or you may think this is a silly idea, but, well, I'm not prepared to do that because I think, why should I? It's not a silly idea, and I am an expert. And I think that does perhaps make me scary.
I see so many people using that kind of deflective language. And I'm not sure whether anyone's truly doing that authentically or whether it is a learned behavior to compensate for all the things that they might have been experiencing. But in my eyes, it discredits you before you even start.
Exactly. I mean, if I'm saying I'm not an expert, or this is maybe a silly point, people are immediately going to shut down and think, well, why should I listen to it?
And you talked in the book about a particular chair where they noticed during a meeting that if a woman started to speak, the men would start shuffling their papers and looking away.
Yeah,
Do
it
you
was
remember
Christine
that?
Lagarde who claimed that when she was at the IMF. And she would actually bring them up and say, colleagues, please listen to what so-and-so is saying. It's important. But, you've got to be Christine Lagarde maybe to be able to behave like that.
But at least if you're chairing something, it gives you the opportunity, once you know about the authority gap and the ways in which that plays out, it gives you the opportunity to at least spot and stop some behaviors that might be happening.
Absolutely. It's really incumbent on chairs to be aware of this and to just nip it in the bud. So suppose you get interrupted, the chair should immediately say, no, hang on, I'm really interested in what Anna was saying there. Or suppose you make a point at a meeting and no one's taking any notice until a man repeats it. The chair should say, oh, yes, well, good. I'm really glad that you agree with what Anna said earlier.
I can see how that would be so boosting. I was chatting to an old coaching client recently, and when she came to have her coaching, she was saying, I've almost given up saying anything in those meetings, even though she was incredibly senior, but she's a black woman. She's the only black woman in that group. And she said, so often I'm either interrupted or I say the point, and then 3 minutes down the line, somebody else picks it up and everybody thinks it's a great idea.
Yeah, classic authority gap behavior, I'm afraid.
And I could see why, in that scenario, somebody has almost given up and thinks, well, what on earth is the point in me
Yeah.
interjecting?
And actually, this is really hurting organizations' performance because people like your client, who I'm sure had really useful and interesting things to say, are being shut down. And that means that teams are going to take worse decisions because they're not hearing from some of the most interesting people in the group. And therefore, the business's performance is going to suffer because they're just not making the most of half their employees.
So even if they did have 50-50 parity in the room, the discussion, the debate, the level of decisions that people were able to come to is going to be hampered by authority gap behavior.
Absolutely. The women are going to be discouraged from contributing, and the men won't be listening as carefully as they should be and making up their minds on the basis of new information.
Can we talk a little about overconfidence?
Yes. So overconfidence is a classic trait found in men, but very, very rarely in women. Do you know, the only woman I can really think of who obviously displays overconfidence is Liz Truss. And she was so unusual, wasn't she, for that? There's a fascinating study done of teenagers in, I think, 9 different countries, tens of thousands of teenagers. And the title of the study, unusually for an academic study, was Bullshitters, Who are they and what do we know about their lives? And they asked these teenagers about 15 mathematical concepts. And they asked, how well do you understand this concept? And how confident are you at applying it to mathematical problems? And unbeknownst to the teenagers, they had inserted 3 completely fictitious mathematical concepts. So I think there was, I can't remember, declarative fractions or so. They'd basically made up 3 concepts that didn't exist. And in every single country, the teenage boys were far more likely than the girls to say, yep, they understood the concepts. Yep, they were confident in applying them. And these bullshitters then overestimated their mathematical ability because the researchers also made them sit a maths test. And they overestimated how good they were going to be at maths. Now, these are dangerous people to have in our world, in our companies, in our organizations, because people who are overconfident make mistakes. And they don't want to listen to people. They assume they're better than their colleagues, so they don't act on feedback. They're really dangerous people to have. And the more senior they are in the organization, the more dangerous they are. I mean, look at the financial crisis. That was created by overconfidence, wasn't it? And yet the trouble is that people are often rewarded for overconfidence. Because if we take people at their word and the overconfident man is saying, oh, yes, I'm really good at this and I've achieved that and I'll be brilliant at this job, you're probably more likely to hire him than the underconfident woman who says, oh, I don't think I fill all the criteria and, I'm not really sure about this side of the job. And yet she may actually be more competent than him. But because we tend to mistake confidence for competence, we end up with a lot of damage in our organizations. There's a very good book by Thomas Chamorro Premuzic called Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? And it's all about overconfidence. I really recommend it.
I would love to read that. And as you're talking, so many of my clients' words are coming to me. So often people say to me, I'm just no good at bullshitting. And I see now at this level that I'm at that apparently I have to be.
Well, do you have to be good at bullshitting? I don't know. I'd hate to say you have to be good at bullshitting. You certainly have to make the best of what you are and what you can do. But I wouldn't want to recommend to anybody that they actually pretend they're better than they are. It's just you want to have an accurate understanding of what you are and be able to claim that and not be underconfident.
And for both genders, we want people to have an accurate understanding of who they are, what their expertise is, the levels of decisions that they can make. I'm seeing from this discussion that for men that could be overinflated and for women that could be underinflated. So it seems like who has got an actual good right sense of what their expertise is and what their level of experience is for an organizational point of view. That seems like the safest, the most effective. From a state point of view, that feels like the safest and most effective.
Absolutely. I mean, the research shows on the whole that women tend to be more accurate in assessing their abilities than men on average. But I do joke, only half jokingly actually, but I write in the book that instead of sending women on assertiveness training courses, perhaps we should be sending some men on bullshit avoidance courses.
And what would be the curriculum, Mary Ann, that you would prescribe for these bullshit avoidance courses?
I could easily design one, I think.
Sounds brilliant. Also, I think it would send out the right message.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, leaders should be saying, we want you to have an accurate assessment of your ability and not, bullshit won't be tolerated in this organization. They ought to be saying. But when I was at the Times and occasionally I edited the paper, so that meant I chaired the morning and afternoon conferences at which all the page editors would come in to, say what they were planning to put in the paper that day. And there was a real culture of bullshit there. So normally, if the editor asked the news editor about a story and you asked about a particular fact, the news editor would be far too embarrassed to say, I don't know, and would sort of start bullshitting and flanneling and sort of half making it up and all that. And he was so used to that sort of behavior. But when I chaired the conferences, if he started doing that, I'd say, look, John, I don't mind you saying you don't know. Please just tell me, though, if you don't know something and find it out. And then by afternoon conference, you can give me the answer. But don't bullshit now.
And I can see that from a position of being an editor in a paper, you don't want to publish things where people don't know what the facts are and they haven't checked them properly. So you actually need to be able to do that. Do you think that also is happening within organizations?
Yeah, I think
Other
it's
organizations.
the whole time. Yeah, I think women are less embarrassed to admit vulnerability than men are because of the way we've been conditioned. But boys are sort of told they've got to be invulnerable and they've got to be better than everyone else, and all this sort of thing, which women are never told. And in fact, women bond by admitting vulnerability on the whole, don't they? If you look at boys playing and talking together, a lot of it's sort of boastful competitiveness. I've scored more goals than you this season, or my dad's got a better car than yours, or they're arm wrestling, or whatever it is. It's all competing. Girls bond by saying, oh, I hate my hair, it's too curly, or my bum's too big, or I'm useless at maths or something. And that's how they get accepted into their group. If they behaved the way boys did, they would be ostracized, right? And the same happens in adult life as well. If men show signs of vulnerability, that's seen as weakness and the other men will turn on them. Whereas if women show signs of vulnerability, that's absolutely fine. So you often see this in a meeting. A woman will say, look, I may be very stupid, but I really didn't understand that. Would you mind explaining that to me? Or if they're asked a question, they can say, I've no idea. I can find out for you, but I actually don't know the answer to that. Can I come back to you later? And they don't feel nearly as weak or threatened to say that sort of thing as men do. So I
Yeah.
feel for men because it must be difficult if you're not able to display vulnerability. The authority gap actually hurts men as well as women in a funny way.
And I wanted to pick up there on the raising of children and how, at that early age, we're setting the scene for the authority gap to appear in our working world. So it doesn't just magically happen when we get to our working lives, it turns out. What did you find out about parenting, about how we raise children, and about how that may be creating the authority gap?
Oh, it definitely does. It starts so young. It's extraordinary. So 3-year-old boys will interrupt girls more than boys. They're 3. And that's probably because they've seen their parents interrupting their sisters more than them. I know, it's agony, isn't it? Now, one of the most depressing pieces of academic research I came across uh, showed that if you ask parents to estimate their children's IQ, and we know that boys and girls' IQs are identical, except at the very far ends of both ends of the bell curve. Uh, they estimated their sons on average at 115 and their daughters at only 107. Huge statistical gap, despite the fact that girls actually develop faster than boys on average, have a bigger vocabulary than boys, do better at school than boys, all the way from kindergarten to PhD level, girls outperform boys, and yet their parents incorrectly think that they are less clever than their brothers. And so boys grow up subliminally absorbing this incorrect notion that they're cleverer than girls. Girls grow up subliminally absorbing this incorrect notion that they're less clever than boys. And the same researchers then asked adult men and women to estimate their own IQs. Sure enough, they found that men estimated themselves on average at 110 and women at only 105. I
Oh,
know. It's tragic, isn't it?
it is. And when you, I mean, I'm guessing you've had this conversation with parents about the fact that the research evidences that boy children and girl children are being conditioned differently by them. What's their response to it?
Well, I find in this generation, they're very receptive to this sort of conversation. And they're much keener to bring their children up in a, slightly more gender neutral way, which is great. So one thing I point out to them quite often is that we mustn't praise our little girls for being pretty and cute and wearing a lovely dress, and our boys for being clever and brave and great at reading or brilliant at climbing a tree. Because then what we're doing is we're praising girls for being ornamental and boys for being instrumental. And that means that girls think that their worth in life is to look good. And we see this already, don't we, with teenage girls and the pressure on them to look good. And boys think their worth in life is to achieve things. And I used to do it, just sort of automatically. And, most people do. You see a little girl and you say, oh, what a lovely dress. But I wouldn't say to a boy, oh, what a great dinosaur T-shirt. I've stopped myself doing that now. And, I'll ask girls, what do they like reading or what do they like doing? That sort of thing.
Yep.
And the
Even,
same with boys. And so one thing that is really important to try to reduce the authority gap in the next generation is for both parents to have equal authority at home, because you're role modeling to them from a very early age what men do and what women do. And if the man seems to be in charge, that's what they're going to do. is to assume that men have more power, more authority, more importance than women. And so you've got to be absolutely equal as parents in your authority, both over your children, but also sort of between each other. The father has to respect the mother as much as the mother respects the father.
And you can imagine all these very subtle cues every day, all day. I mean, all of the different ones that we've talked about, us absorbing those and then just replaying them in our world without really noticing. And my dearest hope that by listening to this podcast is that if you didn't know about the authority gap, you're starting to get an idea of what it is and how it operates in our lives, and that there are things that we can do about it. Is there anything that you would advise us as individuals to do or to be mindful of now that we're learning about the authority gap and its impact?
Well, I think once you notice it, you will start to spot it everywhere. And I think then you can both change your own behavior, but you can also intervene. And I think it's really important to intervene. If you see a woman being ignored or interrupted or patronized or something, just gently, ideally with a bit of humor, call it out. You don't have to be confrontational about it, but call it out to make other people aware of it too. So I think that's really important. Another thing you can do is you can affirm what other women say, because men will affirm what other men say. They don't often affirm what women say. This is what the research shows. But actually, women don't affirm what other women say either much. And so if you make a great point in a meeting, I should say, oh, yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think we should do that. And that helps to bring, to put a bit of momentum behind the idea and makes it harder for other people to dismiss. So that's one little intervention you can do.
And did you say in the book that Barack Obama's team had been using that technique?
Yeah, absolutely. So he had 3 women amongst his close advisors when he first started, and there were many more men, and they would have this meeting every morning to discuss what was going to happen that day. And the women were finding they just weren't being listened to by the guys, and they were just being shut out of the conversation. So they devised what they called their amplification strategy, and they did exactly that. As soon as one woman said something, the other 2 would pile in and say, yes, yes, that's great. Oh, I really agree with that. Yeah, we should really do that, shouldn't we? And after a bit, Obama noticed, and he said to one of the women, what's going on? And she explained. And of course, he hadn't noticed, because men most of the time don't notice these patterns of behavior. And I don't blame them for that, because it's not happening to them. They're not at the butt end of it. And it's become so normalized, they don't notice. But once we open their eyes, they start to see it everywhere. And I've had a lot of men who've read the book saying to me, oh my God, I'm just seeing the world completely differently now. And I'm behaving differently myself as well. So I do want to change the world one man at a time, if I can.
That must feel very gratifying that actually people are telling you this is changing my behavior.
Oh, it's just fantastic. It is so heartwarming. Every time I hear something like that, I just think, oh, my mission in life is starting to be accomplished. And in fact, I was going to write another book about how the authority gap appears in childhood and what we can do about it. But then I realized actually there is so much more work to be done in the workplace about it. So I've set up a consultancy, and I'm going into organizations to help them close their authority gap. Because trying to change the world one person at a time, one reader at a time, I now realize I could do it for hundreds or thousands of employees at a time, and that will make much more difference. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the work, what you would typically do in an organization? How does it look?
Well, the 2 most important, well, first of all, we're going to measure the gap there and see how big it is, and talk to female employees about how they've encountered it. And that will help to give us a baseline for what the culture's like now. And then to change the culture, we're mainly going to be working with the men, because lots of organizations, in trying to improve their gender equality, have focused on the women, trying to fix the women. And they send them on these leadership courses or empowerment courses. And then they wonder why they're still not really moving the dial. And the answer is, it's not the women we need to fix, it's the culture we need to fix. Because if these women come back from work feeling empowered and like leaders, and they're treated just as badly as they were before, they're not going to progress. And so what we actually need to do is not fix the women, but engage the men. And there's been some fascinating research by Boston Consultancy Group showing that in companies where men have been involved in gender diversity, 96% have reported progress, compared with only 30% when the men aren't involved. And so often the men aren't involved. They think, oh, this isn't my problem. This isn't for me. It is actually their problem. And so we run men-only workshops, which are incredibly powerful, in which we get stories from anonymized stories, obviously, from their female colleagues. And we ask them each to read out one of these stories, and it's in the first person. And so a man has to stand up and read out a story that says something like, I was in a meeting last week and I was the main expert in the meeting, but I kept making these suggestions and none of my male colleagues took any notice until one of them repeated it and he got all the credit. And I'd asked each woman to say how it had made her feel. And so then he had to read, it made me feel belittled and humiliated and made me wonder, why am I working in this company? And then for a man to read that out, it's actually extraordinarily powerful, because I could then say, gosh, how would you have felt if that had happened to you? And, he had to admit that, yeah, it would actually be awful if that happened to him. And then he'd say, but that doesn't happen in this company. And I'd say, well, sorry to say, has, because this is one of your colleagues. And, and then the men would say, oh gosh, we're really shocked, really disappointed. We had no idea. And then, then I can explain, well, it's not surprising you have no idea, because it's much harder to notice if it's not happening to you. But we're trying to explain to you how people in the same company can experience life so differently. And once they start to understand this, actually their eyes are like saucers and they say, wow, let's do something about it. And then we can give them toolkits to how to notice it, what to do if it happens, how to try to take the bias out of things like, the people you work with, to clients or to tasks. Because of affinity bias, we're much more likely to choose someone who looks like us to do it, and so then the men get the better clients, they get the better tasks, and they get promoted faster because they've had more experience. And once you start explaining this to them, they really can act differently.
That sounds amazing. And I love the idea of giving them the opportunity to, if you're reading something out in the first person, you get that visceral, that felt sense of how would that actually feel if it was me?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I asked each of the women to say how it could have been handled better, but I didn't include that in what they were reading out. So then we have this big discussion in the group, how could that have been handled? And I say, well, how could it have been handled better? And one of the men would say, well, we could have just listened to what she said in the first place and given her credit for it. And then I'm able to say, well, that's brilliant. You've got it in one, because we actually asked her, and what she said was, they could have listened to me in the first place and given me credit for it. So, you know what to do, actually. It's not that hard.
I hope for everybody listening to this podcast that Mary Ann Seighart is coming to an organization near you very soon to help you close your authority gap. And should we just assume that it exists both in us and in our organization?
I think it exists everywhere. I mean, it's bigger in some organizations than others. The more male stereotype the sector or the profession, the bigger the authority gap is likely to be. But, even in the NHS, which is female dominated, I've had so many stories of the authority gap. I had a story the other day of a male consultant who had a whole group of junior doctors around him whom he was training. And he asked, hands up, who's been mistaken for a nurse? Every single woman and all the doctors of color put their hands up, and none of the white male doctors. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your research, your authority, your wisdom. I think it's going to help a lot of people to have their eyes open to the presence of the authority gap, and also give people hope, because it sounds like there is a lot that we can do to close it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's been really interesting conversation. Thank you for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Mary Ann as much as I enjoyed doing the research, doing the prep, and actually speaking to her. Knowing about the impact of the authority gap gives us the opportunity to actually correct for it, as she says, and do what we can in ourselves and in our organisations to close it so that we can all enjoy better workplaces and a better world. There is a link to Mary Ann's website in the show notes, and I've also put a link to that TED Talk and to her book, The Authority Gap. Thank you again to Mary Ann for being with us, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Bye.
Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident, confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident. confident at work.